method and that it was a good poll. Those are qualitative statements, and any polling has uncertainty with it. It's a technique. What do you have in the way of information on your margin of error on this poll?
So because of the sample size for this, there actually is not a margin of error that's developed. And a margin of error is important in a lot of studies. Whenever you watch the evening news, you'll see plus or minus 3%, plus or minus 5%, which is generally the standard of error that you're going to want to look at for that. But because of the sample size that was developed for this, we have 200 respondents that are being looked at for this sample. And as we go through that, it's not what we would consider to be a normal sample size that you want to place a standard of error on for that type. But it is one that, being a scientist, obviously, those are good questions that you would want.
And was the 200, was that the number that you intended to call, or that was the number that you actually got responses from?
That was actually what I would say is sort of a dual question. From a historical standpoint, when we look at the limited pool that was available for the actual number of eligible voters inside the city of Lake Worth, when we looked at the number of both cell phone and landlines that were available for those, and then from that, know from a historical standpoint what percentage you're actually going to be able to get on the phone, maintain on the phone, and be able to finish, we knew that that was exactly about the number. We had hoped to be able to, originally, before we even pulled to see how many available numbers there were, I told the city manager, I'd like to get 400. That is the number that I want to be able to get. And then as I started pulling that out, I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm hoping they're going to be able to do 300. And then from that, further went and said, 200 is really probably going to be that magic number of where we're going to be. But we will go beyond that point, depending upon how that data is. So if we started getting dots, things thrown on the board that seem to be going in different directions, depending upon where we're going, then you want to further quantify that data to begin to pull it until you began to be able to see something that was verifiable. But call after call after call began to really fall right in sync with that. So when we hit the 200 mark, we knew we were literally done. We didn't go beyond that 200 point.
Okay.
One more, and then let him go on.
Well, as a data guy, very much a data guy, before you look at what you think the data tells you, you look at the methodology and come to some conclusion of how good you think the data is in the first place. Because any set of numbers is going to tell you something. But if it's basically got no, if I measure oxygen in my tank and my meter's not been calibrated, or just isn't a very good one, I'm going to get numbers and I'm going to get patterns and I'm going to get excited about looking at the patterns. But before I get to that stage, I want to make sure, I do a lot of work to make sure that my measurement instrument is pretty solid. So a couple pieces. One of them, I think what you're telling me is that standard polling procedure is you do it in such a fashion that you get a margin of error, so that when you get 57, you don't tell people I got 57%. What you tell people is I got 57 plus or minus 5%. And that lets you decide whether you've got a significant difference between your answers or not. If the margin of error is 1%, that's very different than if your margin of error is 10%. And you're telling me this kind of a poll was so small that we can't even say what the margin of error is.
The reality with this is that we wanted to make sure that we utilize the best in the business, which is Clearview. Clearview and their experience in knowing what is available for your community, their research and their methodology is what I didn't want to just guess and hope that I may have had somebody that has some experience in this field. I wanted to get the best that was available and that we could utilize for this. You don't just want to have data that could have been right. You previously looked at polls and you looked at some of the data and it said whatever you were going to win by 67 whatever percent, and things were kind of odd in that particular sense. So we can go back and forth all night long in terms of some, but what I want to be clear on though is that this data and what has come out as a result of that is something that we feel very confident in terms of looking at that. Now, we can go and you can look...
Let me ask some more quantitative ones. I don't really care whether the scientist has a good feeling on the day that he woke up or not. What I care about is what was his method? Is it solid? And what I'm hearing is that we need to view these results with a good deal of caution because they don't even meet the requirement of a standard polling approach, which would have to be a bigger sample size. Now, specific question. How many registered voters, what was that pool size? What was that number?
We started with about 10,000 is what we had in terms of eligible numbers to be able to pull. So we started in that range, and then from that, it began to be pared down, and that, I don't have the data in front of me, but that is where it began.
So you start with 10,000, then you asked if you had phone numbers with them, and obviously you can't call somebody you don't have a phone number for unless you're willing to do a lot of extra work and expense to get the phone numbers. So the data is skewed by whoever volunteered their phone number.
You know, again, I'm not gonna go down the skeptical track, but this is.
Well, it's pretty important because 40 million's.
Right, if you allow me to finish this, because as you know, when you look at this data, we looked at whether it was Republicans, Democrats, independents, we looked at whether people were homeowners, whether they were renters, we went across the board in terms of this. So we'll show that data, and I think that's why you want to really watch the rest of this presentation, so that way we can walk you through that.
Did you guys meet and talk about this?
Who's that?
Did you meet with Commissioner
Yes,
McBoyd?
we did.
Did he bring up these concerns to you? And I'm asking him, I'm not asking you.
No,
He did, I just wanted to know, okay. I just hoped you guys would have addressed this prior to it, but
Well,
Commissioner, my original didn't been by.
Sure, just very quickly. You mentioned that you were looking for landlines or cell phones available. Did you happen to record whether or not you were calling a cell phone or a landline?
They actually did look at that aspect, so that's.
So did you reach more landlines or cell phones, and do you have that information available?
It was, again, it was about 20 to 30% was the number that was being looked at for cell phones, and the percentage, again, was what was developed by the Pew Research. That's why they looked at that aspect. The balance of those are landlines, and that is, again, from.
That's all I wanted to hear. Also, the time of day of the phone calls, did you record that information?
Yes, these were all evening calls that were being made.
Certainly in the case of whether they were cell phones or landlines, I think there's definitely a demographic issue there. I think that certainly younger people don't have landlines anymore, and the majority of people that do are older. So the fact that, 80% of the calls made were to landlines, I think is relevant information.
And that's what I truly love, actually, about politics and looking at when the time of an election question should be actually asked. And that was my comment to your city manager. Should this be a November question? Should this be a March municipal election? You have different types of voters that go to each of those. You have surge voters, which are those that only vote during a November general election. And they're there for the presidential vote, and that may, many times, often be your millennial voter. That may, as well, oftentimes, may be a stronger Democrat voter during that period of time. Your March municipal election, you have to think about how many of those people will care and take the time and effort to go through that. So these were questions that I asked them for you as a commissioner. If you're thinking about whether or not you want to engage the largest number of potential registered voters within your city to answer a very important question that you're dealing with tonight. That's why my comment to your city manager is, why wouldn't you want to look at appealing to that largest potential number of registered voters in the highest attending election possible? And then from that, looking at the data from the poll as we go through this, you'll begin to see that's why our recommendation is that you look at a November general election where you'll have the largest percentage of voters within the city of Lakeport being able to answer on a particular question like this.
That's the way that I would look at it if I were crafting something that I wanted to go in a particular direction during a particular election. It's also data that I would take into consideration if I were trying to get a true or as close to true result from survey data just like this. So I think you kind of went on a little bit of a tangent there, but really I think it kind of highlights the point that I'm making is, yes, based on the time that you do these things, it may definitely skew the data.
Sorry, Monty Python quote, burn him! No, I'm sorry.
Again, we're in pea soup.
We're in pea soup. Can we go on with the presentation, please, folks? I'd love to see the rest of the presentation, because quite honestly, what I find really ironic is that I'm the marketing person here, who should be astounded and thrilled to death with your polling information. I'm the one who has to, and we're all the ones who have to sit here, we know there's problems with the roads. The roads need to be fixed, and we need to find the money to pay for it. Okay? This is, when it comes off, and I understand where Commissioner Meyer is coming for, it sounds like you're selling something or trying to sell something to somebody. We've already put this before the voters before, so if I seem in, a little bit blunt about it. We put this before voters, whatever, we have a problem, and it needs to be paid for regardless. How much that's gonna be paid for, how much to borrow, whatever, we're gonna have to talk about these conversations. But either way, people have to know that they obviously know we have a problem because they see it every day. And just like I said before, which I will repeat because it bears repeating, the day after that vote was against it, the very next commission meeting, people were up there on the microphone saying, how are you gonna fix it?
First question was.
First question, so what are you gonna do to fix it? So regardless of the polls, the calls, who's for, who's what, I don't care if we jumped up and down and put a clown hat on and told everyone to vote for. The roads need to get fixed, and we need to come up with a plan that's gonna be bearable to the people to deal with it. Whether we have a poll or not a poll, whatever, everyone knows there's a problem. What they wanna pony up and what they wanna step up to the plate and do, this gives you, it's interesting, it shows great insight, and I appreciate the thoughtfulness, and do know that the research companies know what they're doing, and I appreciate the data. I would suggest that we go through the presentation and not take up any more of everybody's time talking about whether a survey is this, that, who cares if it's good, bad, and this is not data building.
Paying for it. Yeah, we're paying for it.
Madam Mayor,
Yes.
thank you. I appreciate you letting me speak. I do, seriously. Who cares about the poll is every person in the city potentially cares. Because, yes, you are correct that everybody recognizes we have a problem.
So how do you propose to fix it?
You also are correct, I believe, in understanding that everybody realizes this is a pretty big financial problem. And so all of us will be asked to write a check. Basically, the city, we are in the shoes of saying, we got a problem, we're gonna sell you a solution, it's gonna cost you a lot. A reasonable thing for residents to do is to ask for details about what is the product they're getting sold, and do they really want to sign on for it. There's not disagreement of whether we have a problem. There is concern about how we're gonna fix that problem, and there needs to be a lot of community involvement, a lot of community input, not
That's not what
pulling.
we're here to do today, though.
What-
That's not what we're here to do today.
Wait one moment, please.
How much
What-
time do you need?
One moment, please. I have the floor at the moment.
You've had the floor for the
Hold
last
it.
20 minutes.
Vice Mayor, please, you have the floor, but
My point is that a good deal of mischief is quite easily done by waving around a poll that says, clearly the community says this, or clearly the community says that. Before you can say, and we've already said, well, it was done by a very good professional firm, it was done, it's a good poll. Those are purely opinions. Purely opinions. The data is what counts. If you have a poll that is so small that it doesn't even have a margin of error, you have to be extremely cautious about what conclusions you draw and put in the newspaper and tell other people. So yes, it is very important, before we get into any of the results of the survey, that we have a clear understanding of what possible biases are put in this poll, what is the level of uncertainty into it, and what is an appropriate level of certainty to say out the end, given those front things. Commissioner Meyer makes a very good point. I don't know if I know anybody, and I'm actually on the older end, I don't know if I know anybody who has a landline anymore. So an 80-20 number is, well, okay, we got two in the room. There's our 80-20 number. All right, there's four. We're going up. There are a lot of people that don't. There clearly is a skew on that in terms of who you're sampling. And the 200 number is a very small number out of our voters. So it's fine to do the poll, but you have to have lots of caveats. And the caveats don't sound like this is a good poll, this is a great poll, this is wonderful data. The caveats are, this poll has a lot of uncertainty, use it as an indication, but you might need to follow it up with real public input.
I understand you made your position very clear, and I'd like to say, in the time we've pontificated over fixing
It's
the
not
road,
pontificating.
I am speaking, I have the floor now. In the time that we've pontificated since the bond referendum, it has cost us, according to a presentation that was done earlier, $9 million by doing nothing. $9 million. Vice Mayor, you have the floor.
I was wondering, could you tell us the difference between a push poll and a regular poll?
I'm not sure, you're talking about push polls that are done politically right now.
Just put the concept of push poll. What's the purpose of a push poll?
I mean, if you're trying to get an exact pulse and you want to see instantly what's going on with push pull, you're going to do a push pull to understand what's happening. They call them pulses.
I'm talking, well, maybe we have a different understanding of what a push poll is. Push poll is where we tell people something to get them to give us a certain answer. Does that make sense?
Well, why don't we let them do the presentation
My
so we
point
can see the
is-
actual
my
questions?
point is, I'm sick and tired of hearing about how the damn poll's put together, because the way Commissioner McVoy is talking about this, he's almost implying this is a push poll, and I don't think
No,
that's what
I
this
never
was.
said anything of the sort.
He's
I'm
just
saying,
the validity.
You're talking about crafting people's opinions. They just asked the people a simple question. You want roads, you don't want roads. What's so unscientific about that?
Well, we can go back and forth. I would like, at this point, guys, we're gonna see the presentation, please.
This is-
Thank you.
This is embarrassing.
It is totally
it
embarrassing,
is
but
a little embarrassing, I would agree.
So, back to the pea soup. What I want to deal with, again, one of the questions, and this is goes back to some of your discussions before. You obviously identified there's a problem. You've talked about it, there's a need, the lack of funding, and looking at the issue. There's been a discussion about the amount of money that would be needed to deal with this question. You looked last time at how much you asked for as it related to that, and there's been a lot of discussion that I've heard relative to should a smaller number be considered. So as we looked at that and discussing with the city manager, we began to talk about if we looked at a $40 million number, what would that be able to provide in terms of the projects and some of the items that were previously looked at? If the sales tax issue goes forward, what amount of money would be provided for that? And would perhaps the two of those together be able to provide an amount that's equal in terms of that amount? So in this survey here, you're seeing we asked that question. And this was in order to improve local roads in the city of Lake Worth, shall the city be authorized to issue bonds for the exclusive purpose of improving local roadways and eliminating potholes and an amount not to exceed $40 million. Again, payable from ad valorem taxes, maturing not later than 30 years from the date of each issuance. And then we also put in, with all expenditures being reviewed by a citizens advisory committee, to try and make sure that we were also adding into that the ability for a committee to be established to help in looking at that particular area. So from that question, 57% were for, 32% were against, based upon what came from that. We then asked the same question, but we, instead of having 40 million, looked at if you went to $50 million. And from that, you can see that those same respondents, the number percentage dropped 50 to 38. So we were 50% in favor, 38% against. Now from that, we actually went in, and this is where we actually began to talk about some of the specific questions. And this is what was asked then of those making the phone calls, which is, generally speaking, do you feel things in Lake Worth are going in the right direction? Or do you feel things in the city have gotten off on the wrong track? 48% said the right direction, 36% said the wrong track. That's a generally positive number when you look at 48%. If it was, 36% said right direction, it may make you wonder, what are these people seeing or not seeing as it relates to what's going on within your city? The second question is, what is your opinion of the Lake Worth City Commission? This is a question that we'll often ask in a lot of polls, and again, it's just one to try and get a feel and a flavor. Some people have no idea who commissioners or council members are within a particular community. Some don't care, some do care, and you'll find that from this, we see that about 48% had a favorable feel for the city commission, 29% were in an unfavorable position. Going on, this is then where that actual question was asked, question number 3, which was 1, and that was where they talked about the road improvement projects in Lake Worth and the $40 million question. And the next one obviously was the one we discussed, $50 million. The phone survey then said, next I'd like to read you some possible questions that you may see on an upcoming elections ballot. With that, what I wanted to stop by saying is, this didn't say that it would be on an upcoming ballot, but that it may be. We didn't want to say whether it be primary, whether it be general, whether it be municipal. We went on to say, after I read the language, please tell me if you would vote for or against each one. And so from that, a lot of this begins to deal with the words that you would in turn use within your poll. How do people feel about repairing and replacing sidewalks? We see 66% were more likely in favor of repairing and replacing sidewalks. We have 29% being less likely to see that. Going on, if we ask the question of enhancing pedestrian and bicycle pathways, we found that 57% were more likely. So you notice that the change in verbiage from that, it was not as favorable an approach towards that. Now that doesn't mean that they're not in favor, but you see it was more desirable from those that responded to say 66% we like repairing and replacing sidewalks. Question 7, repairing local roads. We find out that 70% were more likely, 22% less likely. So now we're seeing a much solid number in terms of those that are saying, you know what, repairing roads is important. But then I thought, you know what, Steve Vancor from Clearview, you know, we need to be a little bit more specific and ask repairing roads in Lake Worth. So when we started asking within the actual city of Lake Worth, the number went to 76% to 17%. So we saw that being a much larger number. Creating safer streets, it came down, it was 66%, and sometimes people don't understand what that really means. And that again is when you see a ballot question, there are times that each of us, when we've gone to the polls, we'll read something, and we're not really sure what it means, what it's referencing, and what it's referring to, and so that is a question that's there. But you see that question didn't resonate as well as repairing roads in Lake Worth. Looking at the idea of having every dollar of the new bonds being spent right here in Lake Worth, 76% were more likely, 16% were less likely. I don't know, Commissioner McBoy and I, we talked a little bit about some of this methodology, and there are good and bad things sometimes. There are some people that have the idea that if they approve something, which is what happened with the Amendment 1 money, a lot of people still in the state are fairly upset with the fact that that money hasn't really been spent the way it was supposed to be, wasn't spent perhaps in an area that it was supposed to be. A lot of people that thought it was going to go to buy land or not buy land, or perhaps help going on with what's going on with Lake Okeechobee. That money in turn has not been spent in that area, and there's been a lot of confusion. So this has begun to be a question that we're seeing more people want to see, sort of effectuated, is that idea of making sure that that's spent right here in the city of Lake Worth. Next, reducing street flooding, 57% to 30%. Again, it doesn't mean that the question isn't important about reducing street flooding, but it is one that overall, the idea of spending that money locally, the idea of repairing and replacing roads was higher. Going into the fact of how about your local property taxes? Would you say your property taxes are too high, or about what you would expect? We're seeing about 56% of those said, you know what, it's really what we would expect. And then going into whether the city is evaluating whether to seek voter approval to issue bonds to pay the cost of improving local roads. If you knew a similar initiative was previously rejected by the voters, would you be more or less likely to vote yes? We find out that 46% said they would be more likely. And that again was one where we wanted to make sure that they realized, you know what, this has been asked before. This is something that we previously looked at. This isn't something that's a brand new question that's coming up. So we wanted to be clear on that. Going into the actual demographics of those, we looked at saying, I would like to ask you a few final questions just for statistical purposes to be sure we've included a good cross-section of people in our survey. First, how are you registered to vote? Of those, we found that 48% said they were registered as a Democrat, 28% as a Republican, 17% as something else, and then 8% were unsure or refused in that. How old are you? We found it from those. 65 or older, we were at 58% of those. 50 to 64, we were at 32%, and 6% were at 35 to 49. And that's one where, again, to Commissioner Meyer, I can see where, again, if we're talking about cell phones versus landlines, there is that question that sometimes comes into play. But again, from those that we know will actually answer the cell phone and actually go through a respondent based upon Pew Research to get quantifiable, validated data for those that will actually in turn also go to the poll, that is the number that is recommended and has been their number to look at, which they obviously have the #1 survey data in the nation. Looking at further, how would you describe your ethnicity? 78% were white Caucasian, we have 6% black African American, and then Hispanic, Cuban descent, Hispanic not of Cuban descent, and then other that were unsure or refused. And obviously, you look at the city of Lake Worth as well, having a growing Haitian population. We know that we have some that have fallen in that category as well. The final question then was looking at, do you own a home in the city of Lake Worth? Of that, 84% of those responded yes, 14% no, and then 2% were unsure or refused. The city of Lake Worth, just of note, which many of you are aware, has a higher rental population. And so even in looking at that, what really was also being looked at was the fact that we also noticed that many of those that were renters were also not necessarily registered voters. And so they were interesting as you began to go through the dynamics of that. For the last thing was really looking at, by observation, 60% female, 40% male. And then this is the question about whether they are a surge voter, whether they are somebody that shows up and they would actually be going to the polls, only in a presidential, 31% of those that responded to this were only your surge voters. 69% of those were your likely voters, or as we would sometimes call your super voter. These are people that would, they've been in at least 2 of the last 3 elections, so 69% of those are people that are generally responding and going and being an active part, or at least stating that they are. We didn't have anything in front of us that said, yes, we actually know you are or you are not. We provided a table for you to just sort of rank order those, where clearly you can see the 40 million versus the 50 million polled higher. And then from that, looking at from highest to lowest of those questions, every dollar being spent locally as well as repairing roads in the city polled higher than going down to those other items. Now, from that presentation, what I would like to say is that what you really need from my perspective is a methodology in this question. I know there are several of you, having met with most of you, one of the things that came out of this was a clear understanding that you have an issue, something that you're going to be dealing with. The fact that we are going to have some ballot language that's going to be prepared and provided. From this, we polled, we used specific words, we tested those words, we looked at that aspect. We have that language that's actually been provided. But for me, I look at it and say, if you were to look at this, I would assume that you would want to do this in the November election. That's where you're going to have that largest sample group, you're going to have the largest number of people that will be looking at that issue. But from that, I would suggest that you need to go beyond that aspect of just saying, you know what, let's go forward and let's just provide for that. You have a process that you can go through. Last time, you all met with a lot of various groups. And that's good and that's bad. In many respects, you're looking at those that are not always going to be people that are going to actually show up and vote within inside the city on any of these various issues. So I would suggest that what you as a group do, so that each one of you are able to go forward and to talk, whether it be for or against, on this particular issue, realizing the city cannot do anything as it relates to being a proponent of this. You as individual commissioners, you actually have a duty and obligation based upon the oath that you took to not only be advocates, but to actually, you personally, not on behalf of the city, have that ability and that obligation to go and be those individuals talking and to be pushing for those things. However, what I would say is that you as a group, aside from the language and coming to a commitment in that area, you should adopt a resolution that declares and proclaims the objectives that you want to have laid out within this particular program. I'm not talking about the specific streets and saying, well, we want within the first 5 years, we're only going to do this street or this project or whatever the case may be. Because you know what? That can easily change in a very short period of time. What I'd like to see you do is to state, we want, and we will agree to a resolution. And these objectives will be to say that your projects, your street projects, or if they involve drainage issues, are going to be working towards creating a community that deals with heat island effect, that's going to deal with looking at the street as it relates, and in fact came up with just a couple of these, and in dealing with the city manager, we would have traffic calming measures that we would want to look at, looking at the drainage sea level rise issue. Those 3 things in particular, I think you need to agree to, put this into a resolution, adopt that resolution, and then as a group, you're able